Hello, and welcome to this month's Live from New Amsterdam. I'm Deborah Hamer, the director of the New Netherland Institute in Albany, New York. And my guest today is Tom Ruller, a former state archivist at the New York State Library. I mean, the New State Archives. Oh, God, terrible. Um, Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Deborah,
Uh,
it's my pleasure.
so, because I said the wrong thing to start with, which was I said the New York State Library versus the New York State Archives, maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about
The New
the
York State
job
Archives and
of
what they
New
do
York State
there?
Archivist.
Be happy to. The New York State Archives collects and preserves the official records of New York's colony and state. So the State Archives has over 33 miles of records created by the Dutch New Netherland colony, the English colony of New York, and of course the state of New York starting in 1777. So 33 miles of material which we collect, preserve, and make available to researchers. In addition to that responsibility, we also work actively with New York State government agencies to identify the important records that of the archives of today and ensure that those records are properly managed and that the records that don't need to be maintained are disposed of correctly. We also provide that same kind of assistance to local governments, the 2,500 units of local governments across New York State, counties, towns, villages, and cities, et cetera. We don't collect their records. We just provide them advice, guidance, legal authority to dispose of records, and legal responsibility for what they should preserve. In addition, we have a system of grants that support that work. We do similar work for non-government records, historical repositories, which are the non-government things, so historical societies and museums. And we do all of that work under one big umbrella. As the state archivist, you're responsible for managing that global responsibility. We also have something called the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, which is a private, not-for-profit organization that supports the state archives and does the work that the state government doesn't necessarily have the resources to do. So it supports some of our conservation efforts and preservation and access efforts. We also, the State Archives Partnership Trust, produces a quarterly magazine about New York State history. It's a general readership magazine. We also produce quarterly a New York Archives Junior, which is a junior version designed for the K-12 audience. Similar for those of us of a certain age, if you remember Ranger Rick. This is Ranger Rick for New York State history. And we provide an online resource of curriculum materials, primary source record materials for teachers in K-12 audience places to use in the classroom that help do a lot of different things in terms of understanding how to interpret information, how to use that information, and how to ensure that the information that you're looking at is legitimate and real. So it's a fairly big set of activities that the New York State Archives does. But one thing that's important, and I think this gets back to your original question, what's the difference between the state library and the state archives? The state archives focuses exclusively on government records, the records of New York's colonial, state, and to some extent, local governments versus private records. We'll talk a little bit more about that, particularly as it relates to the records of the New Netherland colony and the private enterprises like Rensselaerswyck.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So let's put a pin in that for a second. But that's absolutely the most important possible distinction for people. If you leave with one thing today, members of our audience, I hope that you'll understand at the end of this, a distinction between the archives and the library. I do just want to add, in response to what you said, that the Archives Partnership Trust's next issue is going to have some New Netherland related material, including an article by the culinary historian Peter Rose. So I definitely urge our audience to check that out when it's out, and it'll certainly be in NNI's newsletter when it does come out. So that should be exciting.
And you can find out about all of that stuff on the State Archives website, www.archives.nys, as in Sam, ed.gov. I'll say that again about 5 more times, just because I probably said it too quick for everyone to write it down.
Absolutely. And if you have a question at the end about what the website is, just drop an email to our site and we can help you. And while we're on the subject of questions, also please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to leave us a question, and we will try to get to those questions at the end of towards the end of the program. Okay, so the New York State Archives has the largest collection of Dutch documents related to New Netherland. What makes these documents different than other Dutch language documents that are in other repositories? So just as some examples that I've worked with a lot, the New York City Municipal Archives in Manhattan, or the New York State Library, or any of the many church records that I'm sure some of the audience is familiar with. What specific qualifications do these documents have to get into the archives?
Probably the most important qualification they have is that they were created by the government of now New York, but the government of New York, which was New Netherland at the time. So they are the colonial administrative records to administer and operate the colony of New York, or colony of New Netherland. So that if you look at that lineage, that's why these records are in the state archives and preserved as government records and as the predecessor to the government that we currently have. The distinction, I think, and we'll break it down by a couple of different things. The New York Municipal Archives, the Ulster County Clerk, the Albany County Clerk, all have administrative records from the New Netherland colony, but those are from local courts that were established in the city of New Amsterdam or in Wildvik or in Beverwijk / Fort Orange. So those records, just like today, are protected and preserved and made available locally rather than at the statewide, or in this case, if we look back in time, at the colony-wide level. But they're still government records, but they're not the responsibility directly of the state archives. You mentioned the New York State Library, which has an incredible collection of the Van Rensselaer Manor. And it's an amazing resource about the administration of this huge patroonship that occupied a large part of upstate New York. And those records, because they're not created by the government, are appropriately kept by a non-government repository, in this case, the state library, because they collect non-government records. And they have a wonderful manuscripts and special collections section, which includes the Van Rensselaer Manor papers. And then there are church records, and there are church records all over the state. And of course, we're the government, so we certainly don't collect and preserve records of any religious entity. So the Collegiate Archives, which used to be in Manhattan, is now maintained by the Dutch Reformed Church in a separate repository. There are church records all over the state of New York, actually all over New York, New Jersey, everywhere. And those are really wonderful records, particularly if you're a genealogist, because in New York, birth and death records were not kept by the government until 1880. So prior to that time, it's really valuable to have access to the records of religious organizations. Or you can use census information to infer when someone was born or when they passed. But the real good information about births, deaths, and marriages is kept prior to 1880, is kept in churches. And again, the government doesn't collect and preserve religious records.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's also why it's so important if you are interested in doing research, genealogical research, or any other type of research, to be in touch with archivists, because these documents really are spread out all over New York State, all over New Jersey. And it's just not possible really for one person to know where everything is, which is why it's good to cast kind of a wide net when you're looking for information, and having that guidance from an archivist is just essential, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And we have a whole section on this at the State Archives website on June genealogy, and which is a great guide to help people, if they haven't gotten started already, to doing that work.
Yeah, and I think the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society has a really nice program that comes up to Albany and helps people do that research. So I definitely encourage people to look into when the next one is.
Yes.
Okay, so when you started working at the State Archives, can you tell us a little bit about the state of the Dutch document collection as you found it?
It was in excellent condition. It was in excellent state because we had again, this is a fairly substantial collection, although it by some standards. It's roughly 13,000 documents. It had through grants from the federal government, grants from not-for-profit organizations, the Society of Holland Dames, and the support of the Dutch government. We were able to conserve, which means we protected and ensured that all those paper documents were in good condition. And in addition to that, we organized them. We're able to provide much more detailed descriptions than we already had of them. And this is the most important thing, we digitized them. So the entire collection of all of the documents that we have has been digitized and organized using E.B. O'Callaghan. For those of you that don't know, back in the 1850s, a wonderful historian, Edmund O'Callaghan, developed a calendar of all of the Dutch documents and lots of other materials as well. But using O'Callaghan's calendar, we were able to organize those documents and provide a brief summary of the content of each one. And because we had this great collection, which was in excellent condition, given its circumstances, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, great collection with good descriptive information, we were able to digitize all of it. What we did with that digitized content was we built an online system, an online resource that organizes all of those documents, makes them searchable, at least makes the information that O'Callaghan created searchable. And I think most importantly, for those of us who aren't fluent in 17th century Dutch and don't have the 50 years of experience that Charlie Gehring has in looking at that, and the great knowledge and skill that people like you have, Deborah, we're able to connect an English language description or the translation of every one of those documents to the original, or to the original scan. So that now that entire corpus is available for researchers. It's available for those of you who don't necessarily read those documents, but not all the documents have been translated. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the first thing that you said when you started that answer, which was that I believe you said there's 13,000 pages. And there's so much cognitive dissonance for me because in the Netherlands, they consider New Netherland to have very little documentation. And then, when you say the number 13,000, it's like, that's actually really a lot of documentation. So, it all depends on what your perspective is on things. But so these documents though have had quite a checkered history and to reach us right
Yeah.
now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in the documents in 1664, when the English took over the New Netherland colony, New Netherland had laws, had property records, had all kinds of information about the citizens here. Those records were essential for the continuing administration of the New Netherland colony. So the English took them and used them and added to them. And so what we have is this corpus of material that doesn't necessarily end in 1664, but it's essential to have in order for whoever's running the colony to continue to administer it correctly, and fairly, et cetera. So the English have these records. The American Revolution breaks out. They need to protect these records. The story is they put them on a man of war and anchored it off of New York Harbor. There's some, I guess, information about those records going back and forth to Amsterdam a couple of times somewhere in there, but I'll just stick with the little bit that I sort of kind of know, which was those records were safe in New York Harbor, particularly during the Great Fire of Manhattan, which was in 1776. So those records are there and they're preserved. War ends 1783. The records are transferred back to the state of New York, who give them to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State keeps them and protects them until the state library is established in 1818. And it's an appropriate repository for those kinds of materials because they're not necessarily actively used by the government, but everyone recognizes their value and importance. Those records are with the state library and kept in the state library, which by 1911 was in the New York State Capitol. And it was in 1911 that a tremendous fire took on the state library's collection. basically destroying all the books that the state library had, destroying all of the colonial records that the state library was protecting and preserving. Fortunately, and this is, I'm going to steal Charlie Gehring's story, the Dutch records were on the bottom shelf in the library's reading room. So when the fire broke out, the shelves above them collapsed and buried the Dutch records, protecting them from complete destruction. They were destroyed. They were hurt very badly. And if you go to our website and look at some of those documents, you'll be impressed with how much has been saved and how good condition some of them are, but you'll be saddened by seeing some of them which are in quite difficult condition. So one of the things that I say, those records were in great condition, they're in great condition given the circumstances of their existence. So since 1911, those records have been kept and protected and put back together to the extent possible and practical. And so that's in 1973 when the New York, well, actually 1971 when the New York State Archives was created. New York was one of the last states to create a government archive, believe it or not. One of the oldest states in the Union and one of the last to create a government repository, similar to the National Archives, which wasn't established until 1934. But in any event, those records, because they're government records, were transferred to the responsibility of the state archives, and that's where they will stay in perpetuity.
And I mean, I think something that's kind of important to say about the translation project that has gone step by step with these documents is that I believe Charlie talks about how he started with the least damaged documents first, because it's the translation flows the most smoothly and is the easiest when you have the most words on the page. So as we get farther and farther into the translation project, it gets harder and harder because the documents are more and more damaged.
And you'll see in some of the translations, there are sections where words are left out and it's noted that those words are left out because they were damaged by the fire. And go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, and I mean, I myself, and I think others use the calendar that you mentioned by E.B. O'Callahan sometimes to try to piece together a little bit of, sometimes if a name is burned off to find the name or things like that. So the calendar still is, even though it's, by the standards of today, perhaps a bit old, is still useful for so many reasons.
Absolutely, absolutely. We were fortunate to acquire from the New York Public Library one of the documents in the collection that had been estranged in the 1870s, so prior to the 1911 fire. This document was the second page of an important document in Volume 8. It related to a petition from Augustin Hermans. Doesn't matter what he was trying to do, but if you look at page 1, which was lived through the fire, it's yellowed, it's got burnt edges, etc. If you look at page 2, which is the one that was estranged and was not there during the fire, it's like looking at a brand new, beautiful piece of paper. And it almost breaks your heart to know that the whole collection in 1910 looked like that. But
no, I mean, when you look at the older stuff, it's like, I mean, and if you go to the National Archive in the Netherlands and you pull out West India Company documents, some of them literally the paper is so beautiful, so thick, the ink is amazing. It's like you feel like it was written yesterday, even if it was written 400 years ago. So yes,
in the records that are at the New York Municipal Archives, the Ulster County Clerk and the Albany County Clerk, again, government records, they didn't go through the fire. They're in beautiful, wonderful condition.
Yeah, so it's just amazing the paper technology that was available then and the ink technology. It's beautiful.
Right.
So you and your colleagues have done so much work to make these documents accessible to people. And again, these things are accessible to everyone who is attending this webinar for free, completely for free. You can look at them as much as you want. So is there anything
download them if you want?
Yes, you can even download them. I've downloaded them many times. Is there anything specific that drew your attention to the collection or got you interested in it?
Well, as archivists, as I mentioned, we have 33 miles of records at the state archives. And so what we can't reasonably assume that we can digitize everything. But this is a very finite collection. I talk about, oh, it's all 13,000 documents, which is really a tiny fraction, a very small collection. It's also very fragile. The fire led it to its great fragility. That's probably the greatest reason why it's so fragile. So it's a finite group of material that has it's very difficult to make connections for people in terms of being able to access it and understand what they're looking at. And it's very fragile. So it's a perfect candidate for digitization. Digitization is fine, but you also need an interface to enable people to access, understand what it is, and put this digital picture into some kind of a reasonable context in a human readable form. So my colleagues at the State Archives at the time, there's a few that are still there. Jesse Brown did tremendous work in looking at structures, technical structures that would enable us to organize that content and deliver it. Monica Gray, who did a tremendous amount of work in organizing the project, getting it digitized, and feeding this content into the system. And the solution, again, if you go to the Archives website, look under research topics, and look for the research topic Dutch. You can get direct access to all of this material very easily. That content continues to grow. So as documents are found, as strange documents that somehow get to us, or as new translations occur, we're able to update that database and that resource so that the system is not static, really. It continues to grow and evolve as both our knowledge of the collection grows and as the content of the collection grows. Not a lot, 1 or 2 documents every 10 years, but still it is a significant resource that scholars anywhere on the planet have direct access to.
I just want to underline also again what you're saying, which is that just because you digitize a document, that maybe preserves it for future generations, but it doesn't do anything really for accessibility, in the sense that you need someone to go through and make metadata and make a system so that you can actually search it and read it. So from my perspective, I think sometimes people think that the work is done once you digitized, or maybe the work is done once you translated, and that's it. But that's not the case at all, because there's that next level of accessibility. It's not useful to anyone if you can't do any searches. So that work that the archivists are doing and getting that metadata into a form that it's usable is, like, from my perspective, at least 50% of the work. The digitization itself is only 50%, and then there's this whole other
Right.
process that takes a lot of people and effort and time and money.
Yeah, exactly. It's the hard part begins once you have the digital file.
Exactly. Like, if anything, it's at least when you have a digital file, it's so concrete. It's going to take this many. You have this many pages. That can be done. So yeah, getting that metadata in there is really just such an important part of the work. Okay, so I'll just ask one last question, then we'll get to the questions from the audience. So, do you have any hopes for the collection moving forward, for further accessibility? What are you most looking forward to, if anything?
Well, I think we've demonstrated that the collection can continue to grow and it's robust and flexible, and that's good. But there are thousands of other documents across the state. And I'm hopeful that at the State Archives, we created a model for other repositories to use, so that the records in the counties or the records in the churches help scholars across the country, across the globe, get access to those materials. Having the digital files, and if you ask Charlie or Yanni Venema, having digital files for them to work on in terms of translation was a game changer. When I first started back in the Stone Ages, Charlie and Yanni would use these big jeweler's loops to study the original documents so that they could see them and expand, the loop of an L or something like that. All that is now possible on a computer screen from anywhere in the world. So I'm hopeful that other repositories that have similar records look to us as a model and hopefully replicate what we've done.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's so important that I think Albany seems at some distance from some other parts of New York State, but it's so important that the New York State Archives is taking the lead in making this model. And I think, I don't want to speak for your colleagues, but I have always found them to be very helpful whenever I've had any questions about anything. So I take that, I'm so grateful to them, and I take that very seriously, that they take their job not just to be the keeping responsibility for these specific documents, but for helping others with their own collections.
As archivists, we have a dual responsibility, and sometimes they compete with each other. One is the stewardship and preservation of the materials in our care, because our job is not to hoard them, but to shepherd them through to the next generation. And it's easy to say, no one can see this, no one can touch it, because that way it'll always be here. But the other side of that coin is access. And so we have these two responsibilities that have equal weight and equal importance. And the hard decisions that we make, and this gets back to why we digitize this collection, is how do we both preserve it, but also make it accessible?
Yes.
And I think, as you say, my colleagues are exceptional.
Yeah, I think very much so. Okay, so let's get up to a couple questions from the audience. The first question is, had any of the records lost in the fire been published before they were lost, or have they been found in other archives? So I think kind of getting back to your question of how the New York State Archives finds other documents.
Well, there are a number of sources. Of course, we have O'Callahan's calendar, which listed all of the documents that were in the Secretary of State's office. And there were some efforts to translate and publish those. So there are a number of existing translations. So one of the things that's important for us in terms of identifying what records were lost is that calendar that O'Callahan published and put together. One of the things that we know about is O'Callahan organized the collection into a series of volumes, and volume 1 of I believe it's the council minutes, was on the desk of this guy named Arnold von Lahr, who was both translating and stewarding these documents, was on his desk the night of the fire. And volume 1 of the O'Callahan of the records was completely destroyed in the fire. We've recently been able to identify one document, which we can do that because we have O'Callahan's calendar, which was created before the fire, and some other resources that help us know some records have gone missing. But hopefully that answers a little bit of the question. There is a resource at the New York State Library called the New Netherland Research Center, which has a pretty broad collection of published resources, of published versions of many of these translations and many of these documents, and it's definitely worth a visit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're always hoping to find there are people who go through the papers of authors who were working before 1911 to see if they have any transcriptions or information. I personally was just doing some research on some Jewish history, and I found that there was a gentleman who was working on this who he didn't transcribe the documents fully, but he certainly had quotations that we no longer have anymore in his work. So it's certainly something that can happen. It's not something that it's not around every corner, but we're always keeping our eye out. Oh, we have a question about whether E.B. O'Callahan's calendar is available online, and the answer is a definite yes.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's the basis of the resource that the State Archives put together, but you can also find it in lots of places. There's digitized versions of the original published works, which is pretty substantial, but also there's the resource that we put together.
Yeah, so the calendar, you can find he has a calendar for the Dutch papers, and he has a calendar for the English papers as well. So he's always agreed, and there's usually an index at the end. So if you're looking for a specific name, it can be helpful. How many of the 13,000 documents have yet to be translated?
Ooh,
Well, that's a question really for Charlie.
It is.
I'd say what's left is volume 14 and 15 of the correspondence, and volumes 9 and 10 of the council minutes, I believe.
Yep.
So it's definitely, the translation project is definitely not closed, but it's much farther along than it was once.
Right. But I think one of the things that we don't talk about too much are the deeds and patents, some of which relate are also in Dutch and are not part of this collection. They're part of the Secretary of State's deeds and patents records, some of which require some translation.
Yeah, I mean, there's many, many, many more Dutch documents beyond the 13,000 documents in the state archives. So there's no question that there's many more projects to be done. But we are can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel with
The
the
administrative records.
administrative records. And I just want to say that that's most recently we owe a great debt of thanks to the Holland Dames for the Society of Daughters of Holland Dames, to use their full name, for funding a number of translation projects. Let's see. We'll do one last question that's going to be quick. What are some of the unusual documents or objects held in the archives?
The archives doesn't have objects. We collect records. Museums collect objects. So I would say some of the more unusual resources, I think some of the relationships and documents of reports of folks who had gone out and done some exploration that report back to the council are quite interesting. There are a couple of great stories of individuals who might have been taken captive by some of the indigenous folks. So I think those are there. I can't point to anything really specific in terms of the Dutch records because there's so many really great stories within them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, maybe I'm a nerd about this, but I've sat through and read them page after page, and there's always something interesting. So I agree with you. Okay, well, I think we're going to stop there. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And we'll be back next month when Russell Shorter will interview Allison Scatino, who is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at the New York State. I mean, sorry, there's so many institutions at the New York Historical. So thank you very much for joining us. Hope to see you next month.